Welcome to Not Exactly Music, the podcast where I, Kent S. Godfrey, explore multi-sensory tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony. This is episode 2. In this episode, I'm going to tell you all about my background and my history. It is quite relevant, and not just because I want to talk about myself, but hearing about my journey is the important thing. This will really help you understand where I'm coming from and where the Not Exactly Music podcast is going. My background is intimately intertwined with multisensory tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony. All of this that the podcast is about has come from my journey. In episode 1, I gave a really broad overview of the podcast and gave you a little bit of an idea of my background, but now I'm going to go into much more detail. One of the biggest things in my life has been movement, and it's a very big part of the Not Exactly Music podcast. I was very active as a child, and some might say hyperactive. I was always running around, outside playing, climbing things, running through the forest. I started riding a unicycle in the 5th grade and rode it for quite a while. I played sports throughout my childhood: track, football, soccer, cycling, baseball, table tennis. These sorts of things really reinforced my kinesthetic intelligence, and kinesthetic really refers to the sensations that someone has in their muscles through movement. And it's a type of intelligence. I really know my body and I know movement well. Another thing related to movement I got into was clowning. It led me to study physical theater, and I studied dance. Then I got into the very academic study of human movement, including a thing called Laban notation. It's a system for notating human movement, and it really helps you understand the individual parts of human movement. All of these things demonstrate, rely on, and reinforce my kinesthetic intelligence. Another big area of interest for me has always been disability. It's been part of my life my entire life. One reason is that I have a couple of cousins named Debbie and Dwayne who are both blind. So as a very young child, I was pondering things about sensory disability. I remember when I was around 4 years old, I was asking, now, they're blind, does that mean that they can't see or they can't hear? Of course, over the years, I realized that there is much more to them than their blindness, and I understand now that disability is much, much more than not being able to do something. But the important thing is that I was inquisitive about sensory disability from a young age, and I think that has really stuck with me. Due to Debbie and Dwayne, my cousins, blindness and disability in general was really normalized for me from a very young age. I saw a couple people who were completely capable. They went to college and are business owners. Dwayne played in a band, rides horses, fishes. Debbie travels a lot. I admired and looked up to them, and my entire family always has. I learned from them that people can truly be differently abled. I really just thought that with some adjustments, anything can be experienced and accessed through a different or non-traditional way. I've applied this principle to the rest of my experiences with disabled people. My family was always direct and blunt about blindness, which I think is kind of missing these days. People seem to dance around the issue of disabilities and sort of equalize things by saying, well, everybody's equal. But I feel like sometimes things get missed out when we don't really hone in and focus on a disability so that we can cater to it and, focus on what the needs are of somebody based on their sensory disability. And with the, right supports in place, we can then move on to, much more important things. But sometimes I think by not addressing the disability head on, then, we're kind of floundering and not able to move on. Additionally, having Debbie and Dwayne in my life at a young age imprinted my brain with an appreciation for sensory disabilities. Another area related to disabilities has been jobs for me. I started in high school volunteering with my school's special ed department. I've worked as a day camp counselor. I was a sleepaway counselor at a Lions camp in Wisconsin. There, I worked with people with various disabilities each week. And one of the cooler experiences I had there was I was walking on a trail with a blind woman who was singing, and she would sing out into the forest and use echolocation. She could identify where different trees were. So she could say, oh, gee, there's a big tree there because I'm using echolocation. And that actually helps me understand that we can use the different senses to experience the same thing. That was an interesting experience. And another great experience there was how on the first day of blind camper camp week, I got stuck with the two most visually impaired students in my group. And at first I thought this was terrible, and I thought I had really, gotten a bum deal. And what I realized was once we were trying to canoe together, these two students were actually great at canoeing because they did exactly what I told them to do. They were really using the sensations of the paddle in the water to paddle correctly, whereas some sighted people would think, well, gee, I'm just moving the paddle forward and back and forward and back, so I'm doing the right movement. But in fact, you need greater resistance. So these two most visually impaired students I had with me did a much better job than some of the other campers because they were getting the greatest amount of resistance. And we paddled around quite nicely and in perfectly straight lines. Also, when I was younger, I worked in group homes, helping people with disabilities in their daily life. I worked as a personal care attendant for a college student when I was pursuing my BA. This variety of disability that I had at a relatively young age in my life made me very adaptable to different disabilities and really helped me see that they weren't a big deal. Another area of interest was studying sign language in college. One of the ideas that I learned early on studying sign language is that all of the components of auditory language also exist in sign language. So all sorts of vocabulary can simply be expressed in sign language, but then there's also the other structures of language, like grammar and syntax. They just have, a kinesthetic visual version in sign language. This really made me think of how perhaps all of the components of auditory music could also be experienced visually and kinesthetically through sign language. These experiences with disabled people led me to pursue an MA in special education. I gained technical knowledge about disability and teaching, and I also utilized what I was learning to support my ideas of multisensory tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony. During my MA in special ed, I sought out new and exciting topics related to multisensory tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony. Then, of course, I went on to teaching in special ed. I've worked with people with nearly every type of disability, which most people don't seem to do. A lot of folks seem to focus on a specific disability, and I really feel like working with people with such a wide range of disabilities has made me very adaptable. Some of the big areas I've focused on have been students with emotional and behavioral disabilities, autism. I've taught in sign language, and I've taught the performing arts to disabled kids. One story I like from my time of teaching is when I worked with a student who was psychotic. She believed that a staff member had said something to her, and there were several of us around at that time, so we knew for a fact, at least from our perspective, that the person hadn't said this. What I realized was that due to the student's psychosis, she had a different reality than other people did. And I began to apply that principle to other disabilities, which was very eye-opening for me. I realized that for folks such as deaf people and blind people, they have a different reality than other people because something exists because we perceive it. It's not that we perceive it because it exists. So if someone doesn't hear or doesn't hear certain things, then they have a certain reality in a certain world. And someone who hears more fully has a different world. And this can be applied to blind people as well. It's not there if you don't perceive it. And I actually often use, the concept such as infrared. Well, it's there, but, we kind of forget that it's there if we don't have, special technology to recognize it. Or we know that certain animals smell things that humans don't smell, or they hear much better than humans hear. Another interesting example is that when atomic bombs went off, the people who saw that saw colors that don't exist in normal perception, but once we're opened up to it, we can perceive things. I've realized that sensory ability affects what one perceives and what one's reality is. These experiences with disabled people have given me a genuine appreciation for being differently able, because people offer interesting and exciting perspectives. I've seen that people can adjust and adapt. Another big area for me has been the arts. I have a bachelor's degree in acting. Acting is really about observation, which has become a major theme in my life. My BA in acting led me to study movement and physical theater. I thought I might need to be able to dance on stage while I was pursuing my BA in acting, so I started to take dance classes, and that really had a big impact on me. It tapped into my kinesthetic intelligence. So in college, I studied things like ballroom dance, ballet, modern, and a thing called contact improvisation, which later on had a big impact. It's about the experience. It's not really a performative dance form. And what it is two people move together and they're in great physical contact. They're following each other's energy, responding to each other. There's some lifting. This led me to teach creative movement with objects, where I was looking at the object like it was a dance partner, following how the object made us move, really paying attention to the qualities of the objects and seeing how they make us move. I studied at the Laban Center for Movement and Dance. I was studying movement in a very analytical and academic way. By breaking down dance into its parts, I realized that dance and music have the same components, just experienced through separate senses. It's much like how language can exist orally, in speech, as well as visually, kinesthetically, in sign language. A really hugely important thing for me was seeing that music and dance have the same components, such as tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony. This came from and reinforced my belief that everything can be experienced through multiple senses. At the Laban Center for Movement and Dance, I was infusing other topics into my assignments, topics like psychology, special education, anthropology, and music. So it was one of my early times of really making connections between these different topics. And I really got into a system called Laban notation. It's a symbol system for recording human movement, much like music notation, which people are familiar with, but Laban notation, instead of going horizontally across the page, it goes vertically down the page. It was big before video recording, so it would be used by dancers and by anthropologists to record people's movement. It records things such as levels, directions, body parts, qualities of movements, where contact is being made between body parts. And what this does is it makes you see those things. You realize that they're there because you have the language for it. It then exists. After breaking movement down into its parts, I really saw that those are the same parts that make up the concept music, just experienced through different senses. I could literally draw lines between something on a Laban notation movement score and the same thing on an auditory music score. This is part of the ongoing theme in my life that something can be experienced through multiple senses. And While I was studying at the Laban Center, I did a couple of strange things. One was a choreography piece that I did. So what I did was I had pieces of paper all over a dance studio, on tables, on the floor, on the wall, and dancers were drawing abstract patterns. What I was trying to get across was that the sensations in the body and the static thing left on the page were the same thing, just perceived through a different sense. The same rhythms, melodies, tones, and harmonies were just experienced through different senses. In other words, all of the movements related to each other in the same ways that all of the static visual images related to each other. I also did an unusual choreography criticism. So we were supposed to go watch a dance and write a criticism of it. So I went to a train station and I wrote about the movements of the people going through the train station like it was a dance piece. You can treat anything like a dance. The qualities of the movements, the rhythms, all of these things are really the same. A dance and a people walking through a train station have similar movements. It's really just the context that makes it a piece of art. And I treated this train station like the people walking through it were making art. Another aspect of art that was big for me was that I went to Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Clown College. I had been riding a unicycle since the 5th grade, and I got more and more into human movement when I was studying at Clown College. So it had a really valuable effect on me. I studied slapstick, physical comedy, partner balancing, juggling. I was exposed to more academic approaches to movement. Then I returned back to college after Clown College, and I got more into physical theater and more into human movement. And my mother was very grateful that I went back to college and finished my degree. One thing that has been great for me has been to combine disability and arts. That's where I really started to find my calling. I realized that there was a real connection in my work with disabilities and my work with arts, and that connection was the senses. I went from a focus on movement to a focus on all of the senses. One thing I did was that during college, I did audio description, which was where I described plays to blind audience members. I sat in the back of a theater with a headset, and I would describe significant visual aspects of the play so that blind patrons knew what to expect. So I might say something like, Joe is walking on stage with a gun, and then poof, you hear a gunshot. Or, describing who's on stage, where they're at, that kind of thing, so that the audience member has the most important information. I was really given the key components. Once again, this brought out my observation skills and my attention to detail. And it was all about the senses. It was about, what sensory information is this person not getting that is really important. I also refined my ability to express myself concisely. In college, I also did an independent study course in which I developed a system for performing for blind people. What I did was I broke down, once again, here we are breaking something down into its parts. What I did was I broke down a play into its pieces so that we would perform in the round for blind audience members and introduce tactile things for them to feel things that other people might see. They might touch props or costumes. They were using touch, smell, a lot of hearing all around them. Additionally, after college, I was in a deaf theater company where I was traveling around the country performing at deaf schools, and I lived at a deaf college. Once again, going back and forth between working people with different disabilities, this really honed my adaptability and gave me the impression that disability wasn't really a big deal. When you live at a deaf college, deafness is not a big deal anymore. Then, in my life, the really cool stuff began. I started teaching creative movement to disabled people. The big place for this, for me, was my time in the Peace Corps on the island of St. Lucia. Here's how it works. St. Lucia is a small island nation, and there are several small island nations around St. Lucia. So about 4 or 5 countries were grouped into one country group as far as the Peace Corps was concerned, with a headquarters on the island of St. Lucia. So all of us flew to St. Lucia, where we were going to have our in-country training, and then we were going to go off to our different countries. And originally, I was supposed to go off to the island of Grenada, where I was going to be working. And when I landed in St. Lucia for our training, people started saying to me, "Oh, we think you might be staying here if you want." And what it turned out was someone was starting to propose a program to have someone teach the performing arts to children with disabilities on the island of St. Lucia. And they saw my resume. They realized that someone was coming who was well prepared to teach the performing arts to disabled children. So instead of sending me off to Grenada, when we all went our separate ways, I stayed on the island of St. Lucia. And what I did was I taught at each of the countries 4 schools for children with disabilities. There was a deaf school, a blind school, a school for kids with cognitive disabilities, and then a school at the far end of the island, which was 26 miles long. And at that school, at the other end of the island, there was a school for kids with various disabilities. What I did was I went to a different one of these schools each day of the week, and I taught the performing arts as I saw fit. I went around to each class in the school and taught the performing arts. I had an incredible amount of freedom. I developed everything that I was doing on my own. And in fact, it was somewhat valuable for me to not actually have things prepared for me. It really forced me to think and to develop my own ideas. I developed activities, lesson plans, curricula, and teaching methods. What I eventually ended up doing was focus on teaching creative movement and dance. It evolved into me teaching tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony through senses in addition to sound. One reason that came about was that I saw my teenage deaf students dancing and doing songs in sign language. I came to realize that they were getting every aspect of music just through sign language and dance. This encouraged me to focus on that aspect of my work. Here are some of my teaching methods that I developed. First, I guide students in object exploration so that they can kinesthetically and tactily encounter the tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony inherent in the physical properties of the objects. The objects bring out certain types of movement, and I believe that movement that comes from those objects is the same as the physical properties of the objects themselves. It's like the objects are dance partners. By seeing how we can move the objects, our bodies move differently. I also did this with the entire building when I was in the Peace Corps. So I had a group of teenage students, and we would explore the building physically, like rub our hands over the surface of tables, and we would move smoothly because the table was smooth, or run our hands up and down the blinds on the windows, and it would go and that rhythm would get into our body. We would step to the patterns of the tiles on the floor. We might punch pillows that are on the couch, and the idea is that the movement of the punch and the quality of the pillow are actually the same thing, just experienced a different way. This led to a thing I call painting music, in which participants produce patterns on a large piece of vertical plexiglass. Their kinesthesis, movements as seen by the audience, and two-dimensional images left on the canvas are each different manifestations of the same tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony. In other words, the movement that created the images and the images themselves contain the same tones, rhythms, melodies, and harmonies. We can also put those painted patterns on the floor. Then students can dance to them. They respond creatively, making their own decisions of, do they follow this squiggly line on the floor, or do they hop back and forth from, dot to dot that's been painted on the floor? Another approach of mine is to form a multisensory symphony for autistic students. In this activity, each tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony is perceived visually via movement patterns on a video, auditorily via music, and tactily by being touched with objects. First, I was doing these activities. Then I had to find theory to support my activities. So practice came before theory. In the Peace Corps, I used my classroom as a laboratory for developing arts theories and teaching methods. And at that time, I journaled extensively. This was hugely important. What I did was I journaled to make sense of what was going on in my class and to think about it and to ponder all different possibilities of what I could do. So I developed activities this way, and I developed teaching methods and curricula. Then I went back to the class and tested out those activities and teaching methods. And so it was a big cycle where each one fed the other. The journaling was incredibly significant. Then I took my journals from the Peace Corps and I built off of them for years and years to come. I did this when I was studying special education during my master's degree. I did this while studying human movement. And ultimately, I did this during my doctoral program when I was working on how tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony could be experienced multisensorily, because I wanted to take all that practice and all those things I had developed and gain a theoretical basis demonstrating that those activities did indeed convey the benefits related to music. So then, well after the Peace Corps, I taught creative movement to disabled kids off and on for a number of years. I did this in a couple of different countries. Interestingly, when I was in London, England, I had a small grant to work on these teaching methods and these ideas with a group of deaf students. And I also taught my methods at a state school for the deaf and the blind. One of the biggest things in my life has been to pursue a PhD. The purpose of my PhD was to demonstrate that tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony can be experienced through multiple senses. This fits in with how I went from practice to theory. So since I had all these approaches, these lesson plans, curricula, things I was working on, I wanted to then have the theory to support them and demonstrate that they do indeed convey the benefits associated with music through senses in addition to sound. So the purpose of my PhD was to give the theoretical basis to actually show that tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony can indeed be experienced through multiple senses. My degree was in interdisciplinary studies. What I did was I connected ideas from various disciplines to prove my point. I brought in all of my previous practical experiences and all the topics I had been connected to in the past. I had classes in fields such as musicology, anthropology, philosophy, linguistics, and disability studies. I was also exposed to more and more relevant topics, many of which were really obscure. The cool thing was that I kept seeing more and more information and material supporting my hypotheses. So I kept saying, wow, this is great. Wow. Oh my gosh, another thing really proving my point over and over and over again. And what I'm doing with the Not Exactly Music podcast is I'm bringing in a lot of that information and trying to share it with you, the audience, and hopefully we'll keep finding more and more obscure, interesting topics. That's why I'm trying to connect with lots of different people from various disciplines, and I'm bringing in guests who can expose us to new ideas. Now, on a different level, a little bit outside of academia and actual information that I've been learning my whole life, is the area of culture. culture has been very important to me my entire life. One thing is that I have lived in a wide range of places. I have lived in Iowa, Wisconsin, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, North Carolina, South Carolina, Washington State, Oregon, St. Lucia, London, England, and Australia. I've also traveled pretty widely. I've traveled to all but about 5 U.S. states and have been, I think, to around 14 or so foreign countries. And, the thing isn't just, rattling off statistics. There's real tangible experiences that have really influenced me. It really fits into what I keep saying about adaptability. Adaptability has been really big to me. I've been exposed to such a wide range of ideas, and I think it's not just that I know these cultures and I know the people and the things that go on in these places. It's that I can adapt to new things and that I really appreciate seeing new ideas and ways of doing things. Additionally, I grew up with exchange students from 7 different countries: France, Italy, Japan, Indonesia, Sweden, Brazil, and Estonia. I did mention already a little bit about the Peace Corps, but I wanted to remind you, what an amazing cultural experience that was. Not just understanding St. Lucia or Caribbean culture. It was really valuable being an outsider and learning to adapt to that culture. Not only was I able to adapt to that culture, but it gave me the skills to adapt in general. In college, I lived in a foreign language house, so there were people from all over the world, and there were Americans focusing on specific languages, reinforcing my appreciation for different culture. My cultural experiences combined with my study of anthropology that I had during my doctoral program. I realized that culture is another thing that shapes someone's reality. We're not taking in the world around us, but we're projecting our culture, our ideas, and our language outward. To wrap up, this episode is just to give you a little bit of an idea of where I'm coming from and what my experiences have been, to put the podcast and future episodes in context. The big things in my life that I'd like to remind you of are movement, the senses in general, disability, the arts, observation, adaptability, breaking things down into their parts, and connecting disparate topics. All of these are very important to the Not Exactly Music podcast. Thanks for listening. For more information, please check out my website at www.kentsgodfrey.com. Until next time, bye now.